As you know, my name's Heidi Nicholls. I'm a professor of cultural anthropology at University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh. Yeah, let's give Oshkosh, yeah. Got to. That just means I study living contemporary people, not people of the past, that's archaeology. And I look at things like trying to understand the larger human condition. Why do we do what we do? And I tend to look at things like power dynamics, race, and economics, you know, the fun stuff. And for today, though, I need us just to understand the kind of basics of what is culture, okay? So culture is learned. We are not born with our culture, right? We learn it from our families, our friends, our religious institutions. We share culture. You can't have a culture of one. That's imaginary land. And then we negotiate it. We test our boundaries. What's acceptable and what's not acceptable. Culture is complex. You cannot reduce culture to the clothes you wear, the foods you eat, the music you listen to. It's so much more. Culture is an outgrowth of history, right? We're going to talk about history today. We are informed by our past, and our present informs our future. And then finally, we're dynamic. Culture is dynamic. It means it's constantly changing. We aren't the same from 100 years ago, 50 years ago, 10 years ago, and we're not going to be the same in 10, 50, 100 years from now. Right? And one of the ways that we learn, share, and negotiate our cultural identities is through conversations. So I want to talk about where have these conversations gone? And why do I care about that? We live, and I think it's safe, we can all agree to say, in some pretty hyper-politicized rhetoric right now. Polarizing language, right? We use these absolutions and certainties that make it sound like we're saying something fundamentally different, but we're usually using some kind of parallel language. Right? So like Black Lives Matter, all lives matter. Republican, Democrat, pro-life, pro-choice, my body, my choice. To vaccinate, not to vaccinate. Also my body, my choice. Some of you probably are like, oh buddy, where are we going? We're going, that's where we're going. What happens is that we act like we're operating in these super simplistic, and remember, culture is complex. These super simplistic identifiers, and they divide us. They dictate what we're allowed to talk about when we're not allowed to. And the extreme version of that is for us to cancel one another. A lot of the work I do is centered in this EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion work. And within diversity, there's 3 types of ways of kind of talking about diversity. The first is the most common. It's structural diversity, right? That's our demographics. Those are those boxes you have to check when you fill things out. How many of what do we have where? And it's where we tend to try to place our emphasis on, we're going to diversify, right? Get more numbers. Then there is our content diversity. That's about that kind of who has a seat at that metaphorical table, right? Whose voices are represented? So are we reading stories of others, or are we reading another's story? And then there is interactional diversity. And this is about having meaningful, intentional, purposeful conversations with people who look, think, and exist in the world differently than ourselves. Ideally, all 3 of those work together, and we have inclusive excellence. But if we have to pick one, and we're going to pick one because I'm in charge, means we're going to look at interactional diversity. The reason I care so much about this is in that space is where we see cognitive development, critical thinking skills, leadership, civic engagement. In for-profit sectors, when companies like intentionally create inclusive spaces where you're meant to have intentional conversations with people who are different than you, they report being 2 times as likely to meet and or exceed their financial targets, 6 times more innovative, and 6 times more likely to anticipate and respond to change effectively. They give a bottom line of an increase of 35% increase in their revenue and more, right? So there's quite literally a bottom line. Although I would argue that we should care because, we're humans. That should really be what matters. So I want us to stop for a moment. Let's do like pretend guided imagery, right? So you've met someone new. This could be platonic, romantic, professional, and you're getting to know this person. And you like this person. You think they're cool, you vibe with them, you respect them. And then one day, that topic comes up that you see so fundamentally different. You can imagine whatever that is for you. You have a choice, right? I grew up on choose your own adventures. You choose A, disengage completely from the relationship, walk away from one another. But we're less likely to do that when we're invested in one another. B, the no talk rules. What can I talk about? What can't I talk about? Yeah, you guys know that one. And then there's the other option, leaning into it. Try to understand why that person sees the world the way they do. You become the anthropologist. You're trying to understand what from their lived experiences, what from their past informs the way they see the world around them. Maybe you change your mind, maybe they change their mind, maybe you both do a little, and maybe you don't at all. But it's in that space that we see that cognitive development, those critical thinking skills. Because you're having to figure out why somebody that you care about sees the world differently than you, right? And in that process, who knows what comes out of it? That's innovation. And that's beautiful. The problem is we do that when we're invested. But we have more strangers in the world than we do people we're connected to, right? So what do? More often than not, with strangers, acquaintances, that person who also works on the same floor as you, but you don't actually know who they are, you sometimes see them, you know that person. Maybe you probably choose option A, right? Disengage, not worth it, I'm not invested in that human, let's move on. That in itself is a problem in the sense that it's not necessarily moving us towards trying to understand one another. But what I'm talking about today is in that hyper-politicized, polarizing rhetoric that we're using, we're no longer just walking away. We're engaging in really hostile and sometimes violent interactions. I mean, you see it on the news, you see it on social media, you've seen it in real life, it happening in parks, coffee shops, and airplanes, and for God's sake, sit down, it's on the airplane. Right? We see people devolving into this kind of aggressiveness towards one another. I, the anthropologist, I'm like, this is interesting. What's happening? A lot of it is informed from uncertainty and fear. We're living during a global pandemic, racial and social justice uprisings, and a humanitarian crisis, right? The world is changing. We already know culture changes because it's dynamic. But that change is scary. There's a reason why companies care that their employees are able to respond to change 6 times as effectively, right? Because people don't like to change. So what do we do when we're afraid or uncertain? We look for things that make us feel safe and comfortable. And so we wrap ourselves sometimes, right? Because it's always true except when it's not, in our echo chambers. And our echo chambers are those spaces that tend to be surrounded by people who see the world like us. And they tell us we're right and they're wrong, right? That moment that we other people, we're no longer engaging with each other. And we divide and define further and further to the point that we now are silencing one another on what we're allowed to talk about. Cancel culture. One of the spaces we see cancel culture happening in kind of this hyper-intensive way is history, right? The whole discussions, what history can be taught, what's appropriate, what's not appropriate. I'm a cultural anthropologist. Culture is an outgrowth of its history. In order for me to understand in any meaningful way what's happening right now, I have to be able to look at history honestly. Pre-cancel culture, I have students who come into my classroom who've never heard the real Thanksgiving story, the Indian problem legislation, the social construction of race and whiteness, the role of public lynchings as both a form of social control and community building, Japanese internment camps, COINTELPRO, the political propaganda of the Black Panther Party, us, American Indian, you get it, the list goes on, right? And some of that fear says, no, Heidi, don't talk about race, you make it exist. I wish I was that powerful. I'm just simply not. And if I am, well, I'm in the wrong business. But I say 2 main things are happening. 1, the moment we're afraid to talk about something, we've given it power. It holds power over us. The second is when we know why something was created, what cultural purpose it served, then we're empowered. In that space, if we understand why it created, how it was implemented, then we can do something about it. Some people say, no, don't talk bad about our histories. That's unpatriotic. And I challenge you because I don't think our patriotism is that fragile. To love something means to know it honestly, fully. It's good, it's bad, it's ugly. To love honestly. I think that if we empower ourselves, then maybe we can start to have real conversations and do something. Of course, I can guess from my topic here, where have all the conversations gone? I was highly influenced by Pete Seeger's Where Have All the Flowers Gone? So, that song, for those who maybe don't know, look it up immediately after. Please, drive home, listen. There's these flowers, right? These young girls pick these flowers, they give them to these young men. They marry these young men become soldiers. These soldiers go off to war and they sacrifice their lives for our country and they return to those graves. And on those graves, a new batch of flowers grow and a new generation of young women pick those flowers to marry the new generation of young men, right? The story goes on and on. It's a song of interconnectedness and repetition, a cycle. In Pete Seeger's version, he says, when will you ever learn? So he's challenging us to do something about that cycle. Pete Seeger wrote this song in 20 minutes on an airplane ride to perform at Oberlin College. He had been reading Mikhail Sholokov's Quiet Flows the Dawn, which has the Collada Duda in there that talks about that same interconnectedness. Right, so he was inspired. He gets to the concert, he tapes his lyrics onto the microphone, and without the version of the tune you know today, he sang this song. It was widely received. There were students in that audience who worked as their summertime jobs at a camp. And they took it back to their camp, and they played with it. They did round robins around the campfire. They created the verses soldiers and graveyards. They created the tune we know today. Word made it back to Pete Seeger, because clearly this is exactly how this all happened, right? Made it back to Pete Seeger, who then, instead of being like, wait a minute, this is mine, embraced it. Gave Joe Hickerson, the student who was kind of the head of this faction, line credits. He collected royalties on this song. This song was given life collaboratively. Through that interactional diversity, there was innovation. They took something great and made it legendary. Some of you in here may have been like, I didn't even know it was Pete Seeger. Pete Seeger was a product of 1940s and 50s cancel culture. McCarthyism. He was a member of the Communist Party. He was labeled and identified as seditious. So in turn, he was canceled and informally banned from performing his music on TV and radio. Hence why he went to college campuses, high schools, and camps. But when you look up about Pete Seeger, you read things, and I quote, America's tuning fork. He who speaks words of wisdom and peace. The man who sings of American folk beauty. I share that part to say that maybe our contemporaries and our histories don't always tell the same tale. Now, this song came out in 1955. Also in 1955. 1955, U.S. entered Vietnam. Salk's polio vaccine was declared safe. Emmett Till was brutally murdered after being falsely accused of flirting with a white woman. Rosa Parks and others were arrested for not giving their seats up for white folks, launching the Montgomery bus boycott into center stage. But I've been very informed by 2020 and 2021. We've entered a COVID-19 global pandemic. To date, 769,000 U.S. citizens have lost their lives to this virus. We rolled out a COVID-19 vaccine. Enter mask wars, vaccine wars, because we can't agree on any of this, right? Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, along with 161 other African-descended Americans, lost their lives to police and or white vigilantes in the first 10 months of 2020. That's more than 16 humans in a month, more than 1 human every other day, launching the Black Lives Matter movement into center stage. And while culture changes and while we're dynamic, these two are eerily similar. Culture is an outgrowth of a history, but it doesn't have to be defined by our histories, right? We have an opportunity to do and be better. Instead of shutting the door on the conversation and telling each other to get over it, whatever it is, what if we opened the door to the conversations and said, let's get through it together? What if we learn to see each other, to hear each other, to take accountability and to heal together? Start with the I. How do I feel about this? What do I make up about this? When you hear something about history that's uncomfortable, what do you make up about yourself? Right? Because we're responsible for our own thoughts and feelings. When you hear a phrase like Black Lives Matter, what do you think? What do you make up? What do you project? Process that. What kinds of histories are we consuming? Are we being simplistic and looking at things from winners and losers? Or are we trying to tell a story of the larger human condition, that complexity? Experience being in spaces where you're one of something. Be around people who look and think and experience the world differently than you. If you're a Republican, go to a Democrat event. If you're a Democrat, go to a Republican event. If that made you uncomfortable, return to step 1 on I. Check in with you again. But when you're over here, you get to be the anthropologist. You try to understand why. Only when we take the I can we decenter the me and move towards that collective we. The we is where we are resilient and powerful. Pete Seeger and every other artist ended the song with, when will we ever learn? What is it we're afraid of? That we might learn that our histories aren't perfect? That we learn that we don't have it all figured out? That the more information I gather through time, my perspective changes because we're dynamic. We may learn to see each other. We may be able to listen to each other. Maybe we'll learn to communicate. But whatever it is, we learn. So I ask you, where have these conversations gone if they ever existed? And I think it's time that we learn.